Hello, YouTube. It's Charlie in Westeros, and I'm back once again with another Game of Thrones review. Today, I'll be reviewing Game of Thrones Season 4, Episode 2, entitled The Lion and the Rose. Now, before I get into discussing this episode, I have a few things I want to make clear. The first thing is that this episode review is spoiler free, so I will not be discussing anything that happens in the books as far as it concerns this episode, but I will be, discussing the episode as a whole. So if you have not viewed this specific episode of Game of Thrones, then do not watch this review. If you have, of course, then no worries. Look along. You won't get anything spoiled here for you. The other thing I want to mention is that I do my reviews usually by location, so I will focus on one area of Westeros and then another, and I won't be going, scene by scene necessarily. So just to make sure that's clear. And the last thing I want to say is that I've received a few comments in that my reviews are a little too recappy, so I'm going to try to avoid reminding everyone what happens in each scene. So I'll just try to focus in on those elements that I think are really important or are significant to me or that I want to discuss that occur with respect to each scene or location. So without further ado, here I go in my review. So the first thing I want to discuss is the events that take place at the Dreadfort. The episode opens up with Ramsay Snow chasing after a young girl in the woods with his friend, who apparently is named Miranda, and Theon Greyjoy, who now identifies as Reek, basically. The first thing I need to say about this scene specifically is that the young woman assisting him, Miranda, is the exact same character as one of the two prostitutes Ramsay uses to try and, I guess, arouse Theon during one of his torture sessions in the last season, right before he was, castrated. I also thought this dynamic between these two characters was interesting. Well, first because the character of Miranda isn't really addressed in the books, and I do kind of wonder what her relationship with Ramsay is. Are they more than friends? Is she even significant? And especially, what happened to the other girl that was there last season, who was trying to seduce Theon with her? Even more importantly, where the hell did Ramsay find people like her? Not even just her and the other girl from last season, but we get the idea that so many of the Bolton's men are sadists. Including the guy who actually cut off Jaime's hand, and we get a quick scene with him and Ramsay discussing how wonderful and how excited Ramsay would have been if he got to see it for himself. I think that this is probably the only, and I think it's the first noble house in Game of Thrones where almost all their members and all people associated with them are just completely negative and evil characters. Usually you get characters from each family who are either good, bad, or a combination thereof. There's no really any extreme, except maybe with the Starks, who are usually just totally good, I think. But it really is like this family is the polar opposite of the Starks in almost every respect. I was also very intrigued by the relationship between Roose and Ramsay, I gotta say. I think to kind of add to the contrast between the Starks and the Boltons, where Ned, is fairly close to Jon and he's really kind to him, Roose, on the other hand, does nothing but chastise Ramsay and kind of insults him this episode, as we got to see. I also find this parallel even more intriguing because in Season 1, we have Ned tell Jon that he is his blood, and even if he doesn't have his name, he is still, a Stark in spirit. Whereas in this season, we have Roose, who, jumps immediately on the occasion to remind Ramsay that he is not a Bolton and that he is a Snow, which means he is a bastard. So again, I think that we are constantly given the setup that the Boltons are, both literally and figuratively the antithesis of the Starks. Another thing I was wondering about is, now that the Starks are more or less gone, how on earth are the Boltons going to assert their power over the other northern houses, who surely won't forget the fact that the Boltons betrayed Robb Stark to the Lannisters? And of course, with the Ironmen still in the north, all I see is a lot of violence and conflict and vengeance for the future of the Northmen, considering how totally divided that land is right now without the Starks to lead them. And of course, Roose and Ramsay are very aware of this when they find out that the two Stark boys are still alive, because now they want to find them and make sure they can't be used as a rallying point for the other Northmen. Oh, another thing I want to mention, in case anyone forgot, is that Roose Bolton was promised a wife by Lord Walder Frey, and was to receive the wife's like literal weight in gold, based on whoever Roose Bolton were to pick out of Walder Frey's daughters. So the woman we see arriving actually back at the Dreadfort during this early scene is actually Walder Frey's daughter Walda, just in case anyone forgot who she was. So the next location I would like to address are those events taking place north of the Wall in this episode, and of course this basically just focuses in on those things that are happening to Bran. Now I will say the Bran scene was very short, but oh so sweet. The first thing I would like to say is that when he touches the weirwood tree, it looks like we get a glimpse of things from the past, the present, and especially the future, I think. One of the two most noteworthy scenes that he sees is actually the exact same one Daenerys sees 2 seasons ago when she is at the House of the Undying, when she's trying to find her dragons after they're stolen by those creepy warlock guys. Yeah. She's walking through, in this specific scene when she's in the House of the Undying, she's walking through a burnt out throne room at King's Landing, and she sees the Iron Throne that's empty, and there's like snow falling, and the roof of the, I think it's the Sept of Baelor, no, the throne room, wherever that is, it's burnt right through, and Bran effectively sees the exact same thing in his own dream, which clearly means that something's going to happen in the future where King's Landing is going to get attacked by a dragon. And obviously this gets reconfirmed in another clip that Bran sees when there's a huge dragon shadow flying over King's Landing. I once thought that this clip with the dragon flying over King's Landing was more of a symbolic thing when we saw it, during the trailer for this season. And it wasn't meant to be literal, but clearly, this is an indication of things to happen, at least I think, anyway. Again, this is not something I necessarily know, but I do have a feeling that the dragons are going to get to King's Landing at some point, and clearly a ruined throne means that the dragons will play some kind of role in, wreaking havoc in that city. Irrespective of what happens, I do look forward to finding out what goes on there. Bran also hears an older voice that says, look for me beneath the tree, north. And, whoever's voice that belongs to is clearly someone Bran wants to find, because he resolves himself to go and look for that voice somewhere north of the Wall. I will not spoil anything as to who that person is or what this means, but this is clearly something very significant, and I look forward to discovering the source of that voice. Now I'd like to discuss the things that take place at Dragonstone. I gotta say that I'm increasingly freaked out by Stannis' wife, Selyse. I never thought anyone could be any creepier than Melisandre, but I think that Selyse really takes the cake, and considering she was so happy watching her brother burn and die at the stake, let's just say I'm very afraid of what she could do to Shireen, her daughter. I didn't have much more to say on this scene specifically, but I will say Shireen is probably one of the sweetest characters in the series. Another thing that we find out from the scene is that Melisandre's religion doesn't believe in a hell, except, the hell we live on, Earth. Which I thought was kind of interesting, because in a weird way it shows us a slightly positive side to that very violent religion, considering, that these people who worship the Red God seem to believe that after burning people, such as Selyse's brother, they're going to be happy because they're going to be with their maker once again, or at least that was the sense that I got from that scene. So I could be wrong, or maybe I just want to see the positive in everything, so I guess you can comment on that. Afterlife with the Red Fire God, good, bad? Let me know. I think it goes without saying that the brunt of this episode focuses in on King's Landing and the events that take place there, such as the wedding, so bear with me, there's going to be a lot to say on that specific location. I think the first thing I would like to discuss is that before the wedding even starts, I gotta say I really loved that quick scene between Tyrion and Jaime. Not only was it sweet, but it obviously reaffirms that Jaime and Tyrion are fairly close, unlike, Tyrion is to Cersei and his father. That said, the first thing we do see in the scene is obviously foreshadowing the events at the end of the episode where Jaime knocks over a wine goblet and Tyrion pours his own goblet out and just says, "It's only wine." And, well, as we later learn in this episode, clearly wine isn't always wine. Eerie. Beyond that, however, I will say that the scene was important because it sets up the idea that, at least I feel, that Tyrion and Jaime are close enough to have each other's backs in many situations, even if things are pretty rough for both of them, or either of them. You know, Tyrion helps Jaime by giving him a discreet swordsman in Bronn to help train him, as well as, you know, he encourages Jaime. So I think knowing this, my show viewer instincts will tell me that Jaime won't be as inclined as everyone else is to believe that Tyrion killed Joffrey. And at least I hope he might offer Tyrion some form of leverage in this matter or help. At least that's what I personally, as a show viewer and not as my book theater self, hope for. Anyway. So after Tyrion finds out that Cersei and Tywin know about Shae, I am pretty glad he did send her away, naturally because I don't want to see her die. But I will say I do think he could have, you know, approached her in a more honest but still forceful way, rather than just be mean and lie to her if he, you know, forced her to leave. You know, my heart really broke for Shae, but at the same time, she must know that he is lying through his teeth about how he feels for her. I truly think Shae is a smart person, so I really hope she doesn't think Tyrion completely hates her. Anyway, as far as we know, she is sailing away from Pentos, but I gotta say, I am still very worried for her because every time like a scene seems too good to be true, like somebody seems to be too safe, you know, that person always seems to fall prey or trapped to some horrible condition or misery. So, again, I think it's a little too good to be true that she left King's Landing at this point. Later on, we have Olenna and Tywin talking about after the marriage itself, and we get a couple of interesting lines between them. Olenna says, you know, the Iron Bank will have its due, and Tywin replies, sorry, Tywin, not Tyrion. Tywin replies, "I am not worried about the bank." I think alone, this is not an overtly significant statement, other than the fact that the kingdom is quite in depth. But I think when you add it to the next sequence of events and statements that are made, I think it becomes pretty interesting because it does remind us, the viewer, that, you know, a Lannister has to pay his debts, and if they don't pay up their dues to this Iron Bank, trouble could come their way. And although I'm not going to say that Joffrey's death is directly related to this event, it kind of does add a slight layer of foreshadowing to that death at the end of the episode, at least I feel. Again, Olenna also delivers another very foreshadowy line when she goes and speaks to Sansa. She says, and I quote, "I am sorry about your brother, but killing a man at a wedding is horrid. What sort of man would do such a thing?" And again, this sets us up with the idea that, you know, Joffrey's death is going to come at the end of this episode. It's foreshadowing very strongly again. I will say I'm quite interested by the fact that Olenna used the word, "what sort of man would do such a thing?" So, I don't know if that hints towards the fact that a man killed Joffrey, or maybe she's being kind of sarcastic, or maybe it's like a sarcastic line, and that it implies, like, you know, it won't turn out to be a man, it will turn out to be a woman, you know? Who knows? There's so many strong, powerful women out there in this show who want their vengeance against Joffrey, so, and men too, of course. So I wouldn't be surprised if it turns out to be somebody totally uncalled for, as far as the show is concerned. I will also say that the Martells, on a totally different note, are highly comedic in this episode. If slightly over-exaggerated, I felt. I mean, there was one scene where they go and stare at an acrobatic woman doing the splits, and it looks like they're just staring at her for like a while. At least that's the impression we're given as the scene kind of cuts away. And later on, we see Oberyn Martell kind of giving Loras Tyrell a seductive look as Ellaria Sand puts her fingers in his mouth. It's quite intriguing. I will say, though, that Cersei was getting into a lot of conflicts during this wedding. The first thing is that she had a weird confrontation with Brienne over Jaime. So we had a little cat fight going on there, even though Brienne kind of backed out of it and was like, yeah, I'm not getting engaged in this. And then, of course, right after that, Cersei goes and insults Maester Pycelle and tells him to leave and give the leftovers to the dogs because, you know, Marjorie wants to set a good example by giving the wedding leftovers to the common folk out in the city. But in this case, Cersei wants to, I guess, kind of foil that intention of Marjorie's by giving it to the dog. So I guess she's trying to kind of ruin Marjorie's name a little bit there in that instance. And then again, we have another awkward instance where Cersei and her father Tywin have a weird interaction with Oberyn Martell and Ellaria Sand. Now, this specific interaction, I think, between the Lannisters and the Martells was very noteworthy for the following reasons. The first one is that Oberyn makes the statement that, quote, the rape of women and children is considered distasteful. And again, he implies how it's fortunate that Cersei's daughter Myrcella is, quote, living in Dorne now. Now, this can, of course, be read a number of ways, since, A, it implies that Oberyn and Dornish people in general don't like to harm children, which would hint at the idea that Oberyn wouldn't harm one himself, which is a bit ironic since shortly thereafter a child will be dead, i.e. Joffrey. So it would be a twist of irony if it were to turn out, hypothetically, that Oberyn did the deed for killing Joffrey. On a more basic level, though, it is an interesting line, since it is also a bit of a backhanded jab at Cersei and Tywin, since it reminds them that, they have Myrcella in Dorne, and her fate is in their hands. Even if they wouldn't, hurt a child, as they say, they still have her with them. So, it's a bit of a reminder that they gotta watch their mouth sometimes around the Dornish people. Most importantly, however, and obviously the most obvious, is of course that this line was a reminder that Oberyn hasn't forgotten the rape and murder of his sister Elia and her children by the Mountain, who is supposedly raped and destroyed their bodies in as was stated in the previous season. So just a little reminder to Tywin that, assuming that he was the one who gave the Mountain the order, that Oberyn hasn't forgotten this slight. So kind of hints that, even if Oberyn isn't the culprit in this scenario for having killed Joffrey, he is still naturally a suspect. Moving it along, I also want to discuss the short dwarf war scene that took place during the wedding. Now, I didn't quite notice it at first, but I will say that all the kings fighting were riding different interesting beasts. Like, for example, Stannis was riding a cutout version of Melisandre. Renly was riding what looked like Sir Loras Tyrell, and at least when the dwarf version of Renly was attacked by Stannis, Loras did seem pretty as disgust, and he did leave the scene, if I do recall correctly. And I will say that I was quite surprised how almost everybody watching the scene was, at least it seemed that they were all pretty much disgusted, aside from Cersei and Joffrey, really, which I guess kind of tells us that the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. Now, before I get into discussing the whodunit of who killed Joffrey, I would like to mention the irony in the name given to Joffrey's wedding gift, the Valyrian sword. Now, of course, when we hear that he wants to call it Widow's Wail, the first person that comes to mind, at least in my opinion, is Catelyn Stark, since not only was she a widow after Season 1, but her wail when her son Robb was killed is mentioned by a number of characters after, the fact that it occurred last season. However, I think the sword was naturally an important foreshadowing during the episode, since Cersei's role as a widow, i.e. as a former queen, is mentioned a few times during this episode, and when, Joffrey finally dies, her wail is ridiculously loud, and I think, in a sense, that this name for the sword was poetic justice, that Joffrey died after receiving it as a gift, as a sword that once belonged to his former enemy, and also that he died in a very, very similar circumstances to this same enemy, that is Robb. So, Widow's Wail seems to be a bit of a bad luck name for that sword. Now, since I have already read the books, I think I will not. Well, I know I will not give away any information behind Joffrey's killing, or I will not reveal who did it. But I will present to you some of the thoughts that my friend and my sister made on who killed Joffrey when they watched the episode last night. And also you can check out their reactions in my Purple Wedding reaction video. You can see their reactions in the Purple Wedding reaction video that I will post below. So, my sister thinks it was Sansa because not only did she pick up the wine cup after it fell and handed it to Tyrion, but she also escaped with the fool Sir Dantos, when Joffrey started choking on the wine, and she is, probably the one, according to my sister, who has the most reason to want Joffrey dead. That is, for the murder of her brother, of her father, of her mother. The list really goes on at this point. Now, on the other hand, my friend Pronica thinks that it was Olenna Tyrell or maybe Margaery Tyrell who were responsible for the death of Joffrey, because she thinks that they want to be able to control a king, and Joffrey was clearly not someone who could be controlled by Margaery. She also made the point that since Margaery didn't consummate her marriage to Joffrey, she could maybe marry again, probably Joffrey's younger brother, who will assumedly become king now and, retain power. Well, at least Margaery would assumedly retain power, or Lady Olenna would retain power through this younger king. Of course, these are their thoughts, and neither of them have read the books, or even know what's up. So take it for what it is. These aren't spoilers; they're just their opinions. Of course, there are so many other suspicious characters at hand too. Right now, they're blaming Tyrion, looks like, for the crime, and along with him, there are people like Varys, the Martells, heck, even maybe Shae could want vengeance on Tyrion for having broken her heart. Maybe she had a role to play in this, or maybe she orchestrated it. Who knows? I'm just throwing out the fact that there's so many people out there who could have done this murder of Joffrey. Whoever it is, I think nobody's really upset about it. I gotta say, this episode was hands down satisfactory to the nines. I think all my friends were pretty happy after they watched it, I gotta say. It wasn't as epic as, the Red Wedding or Ned Stark's execution, or even when Daenerys killed the slavers and freed all the slaves in last season. But it was still a pretty cool episode, a pretty, again, satisfactory one. So if I had to give it a really strict rating, maybe 9 out of 10. Very strict, 9.5 tops. Yeah. Anyway, that's all for this episode review for Game of Thrones. Again, if you enjoyed this review, by all means, like this video. Please subscribe. Comment if you have any thoughts or commentary or criticisms. I totally embrace constructive criticism. Anything to help my videos, get a bit more pleasing to the viewer, more enjoyable for you guys. So by all means, let me know if you have anything that you want to say. Again, as long as it's nice or constructive. So, yeah. I guess that's all for now, guys. I will see you all a week from now for my review for Game of Thrones Season 4, Episode 3. Until then, take care.